Hey everyone, welcome to another edition of Team Engagement Live. Hopefully we can start to see, there's a whole bunch of people actually joining, coming in every second. So I'm Ben Colley, I'm the COO at Teamgage, and I'm joined today by Mark, as you can see. So we're just going to wait probably 30 seconds and give people an opportunity to join. There's 20, 30 people joining at the moment. Before we jumped in this call, we were actually just lamenting how cold it is. So I'm based here in Adelaide. Mark is in Melbourne, and it's really freezing right now. How are you feeling, Mark?
Oh, look, I love it when it's a bit warm. I was in New Zealand just a couple of weeks ago, so I've got sort of used to how chilly it can be. But being in Melbourne, I think it's even colder than it was in New Zealand a couple of weeks ago. So it is freezing, and wake up in the morning and trying to go for a run is quite problematic at the moment.
My wife and I have just moved into a home, and it was built in the 1890s, and we're really discovering that being particularly sealed from the cold weather is not a strong point of a house built in the 1890s. So it's been a challenging couple of weeks.
Didn't you also say you'd moved into a corner store, or?
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's an old cottage and corner shop. So it's a special house, and it's a beautiful looking house. But yeah, it's cold. Anyway, look, I can see there's a whole bunch of people who have joined us today. So I think we'll jump into this. So a really kind of brief introduction. As I mentioned, my name's Ben Colley, and I'm the COO at Teamgage. So for those of you that may not know Teamgage, we're an engagement tool that puts the team first. Our platform was created around the concept of team huddles, where a team actually gets together and discusses the way that they're working together, what's working, what's not, and then they put actions in place to actually improve. And it's really based on surfacing ideas, surfacing blockers, giving a simple mechanism and framework for teams and leaders to collect that feedback and then turn it into an actionable result that can actually improve the way that team works together. It's really based on or built on the principle of continuous improvement. And I'm joined today with Mark Truelson. And Mark is a speaker and mentor and advisor. He's passionate about building disruptive programs that help people think differently and change the way they're working and change their personal lives at the same time as well. He really works with leaders and organizations on this concept of complacency or a complacent culture, and then replacing that with a culture of creative enthusiasm. He's worked with the leading companies around the world. We're talking CUB, BlackRock, Pepsi, Coles. I'm going through the list here: Treasury Wine Estates, Kraft, the AFL. So a real long list of large organizations. And I pulled out this one little quote, Mark. I'll throw to you in just a moment, but you had on your LinkedIn, this line really resonated with me and the background of Teamgage. It said, "The only sustainable blue ocean strategy is the disruptive capability of your team." And I thought that was a great place to probably start our conversation. But I'll hand over to you, Mark, if there's anything you wanted to add to introduce yourself.
Probably the only thing I'd like to add to that is probably 2 years ago, I got disrupted myself. The whole sort of speaking consulting industry got totally disrupted through COVID. So a couple of guys sort of approached me and said, do you want to launch a beer out in the marketplace? So we launched a beer called One, which is a lower alc beer. So it's a shameless plug. It's in Dan Murphy and BWS. So that's something we've done the last 2 years, which has been a lot of fun.
Love that. I do love the shameless plug. Haven't yet done a taste test, but after this call, I might have to head down to Dan's and see if I can pick up a can.
Yeah, I think getting to that quote, I think it really resonated with me when, I read the story of Whirlpool, because I think a lot of people look, when they look at the most innovative companies, they look for the real cool latest startup, or and we hear all the war stories of Elon Musk and Apple and Google, and there's just a plethora of just new startup companies, and the one that really stood out to me was Whirlpool. Whirlpool, there's nothing really on the outside saying that it's exciting, and yet they have really adopted this systematic approach of embedding innovation and creativity with all their people in their workplace. And And that's where that sort of quote sort of was born, that, you know, you can copy strategies. You know, even a company as amazing as Teamgage, I'm sure there are people out there, you know, can follow and adopt their strategies. But it's when you embed that systematic capability across all your people, and they are encouraged to bring their passion and their gifts to the workplace every day, that's something that can't be replicated or copied. And when you do that, great things happen.
Yeah, there's a couple of things that stood out to me on that. Is one, you're spot on. Sometimes it's easy to be distracted by the shiny new things, but there is something to be said for companies that have lasted for 50, 60, 100 years. And what are the strategies that they put in place? And one of them is using a term that's probably thrown around a lot now, but it's like they disrupt themselves because the market, the environment is constantly changing. So that stood out to me. And then the second one is obviously, yeah, just that idea, I suppose, of constantly changing the way you work, and really looking at that internally and using that as your competitive advantage.
And I think the results sort of borne out with Whirlpool, that, you know, their pipeline went from, say, $50 million that was born from innovation to over $4 billion.
Yeah,
and they really drove an agenda that, you know, innovations from everyone, everywhere. And, you know, one of the key sort of examples of that, 10% of its workforce are what are called innovation black belts. So, you know, there's a lot of companies out there that, you know, might look at, you know, outsourcing their innovation, but they went the other way and internalized the innovation capability. And with that, it ensured that they're a great place to work and come up with amazing products.
Yeah, great. Well, that's where we want to get to. So obviously we had a bit of a conversation before this, and one of the things we touched on was this concept or this idea of a culture of complacency. And perhaps that's something that has started to really rear its head as a byproduct of COVID, or really COVID and the pandemic really started to actually shine the light on it. So if we're aiming for this incredibly innovative culture, but we do have this perhaps complacent culture to start with, is that something you could just explain to everyone here? Is like, what does complacency mean? How do you identify it? How do you diagnose it? What does that mean to you?
Yeah, I think, look, I think if we use the term comfort zone, I think most people would associate nearly every workplace they've been in, you know, the culture has been in a comfort zone, and sort of to disrupt yourself out of that comfort zone, you'd either need to be in a fight or sort of flight sort of mentality. You know, if you're in a fight mentality, you'd be all growth orientated. If you're in a sort of a flight mentality, you'd be in a sort of fear zone. And I think in those instances, if you're in a growth zone or a fear zone, they're driven by feelings. So you know when you're a part of a culture that's growth orientated, because everyone's buzzy and everyone's enthusiastic and everyone wants to do things. Just as much as when you're in a fear zone that, yeah, people are complaining, they're resigning, they want to get out. I think what we've seen though is that during COVID, I think we've added a new element. I think for the first time, we've actually had disruption impact us all. So I remember a couple of years ago when I'd speak on disruption, and most people wouldn't even sort of know what it meant. It was one of those terms that, what does it actually mean? But what COVID has done is brought disruption in our life and in every way, shape possible. And I think the other element I think I'm really fascinated with post-COVID is this whole numb zone, because I think that's the one we really have to look out for. I think numbness is really dangerous in terms of a cultural aspect, because like I said, if you're in a growth zone, everyone's happy and pumped up. If you're in a fear zone, you can see the signals. But a lot of times when you're in a numb zone or a numb culture, people aren't seeing the signals. And often when you see the signals, it's far too late. So I really think that it's important, because, you know, the isolation has taken place. We've, you know, a lot of us have been working from home, and some of that's been amazing. Some of that has meant that the connections just aren't as engaging as they once were. So there is a numbness that's crept in, which I think will have a lagging effect moving forward.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose there's two parts to that. If your culture or your teams have started to become a bit numb, there's what you referenced where people may leave, the people that you need, either potentially the highest performers or or just people that are like, this is no longer the right place for me. But then I suppose there's also a flip side for that, where people become very comfortable with that numbness and stay, but stay in that state, which is not the best state for them as an individuals, nor for the team or the entire organization.
And I think even a third set is that they're willing to stay, but they're not in a capacity to actually be productive because they are so numb. And I think it's identifying the onset of that numbness that's really important. There's, one area that looks at this fear really, from a different perspective, rock climbers. Their greatest fear isn't heights or snakes on rocks. Their greatest fear is when they have the onset of numbness in their fingers, because they know that they're in trouble. It's called carpal tunnel syndrome, or CTS.
Yeah.
And I think we as leaders and teams have to look at where is it that CTS is impacting our cultures. So where is it that we're caring less, or we're talking less, or we're seeing less? And I think that's a really important thing for us to be able to identify, especially when we're in a hybrid world or a fixed, flexible world where, a lot of people are not in the office for a lot of those things to be prevalent.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That good analogy. I like the rock climbing one. I've got a couple of friends who do that. So I'm looking forward to referencing that in future conversations. But okay, so what's something like really practical that the leaders and the executives that are listening today, what's something perhaps practical they can take away from this conversation around how to maybe look if there is some numbness developing in a particular team or an area of the organization? What's something you would recommend they look at doing?
Well, I think what I'd like to probably, move to is that how do you go from that numb zone into more of an energy zone? And I think, as teams and leaders, that's the aspect that I would love us to focus on, as for cultures, around the world, because I think there used to be this mentality that there was a silver bullet.
Yeah.
And I think, that's no longer a play. That was something that may have been great 10 years ago, but especially because of COVID, it's a lot more complex to get your teams and individuals engaged and passionate about turning up to work, because there's just so many ramifications for now getting this wrong. So in terms of some practical tools, I think what we now have to do is look at it holistically. So how do we move to a situation and how do we disrupt our teams to move from a numb zone or a comfort zone into an energy zone? And probably the metaphor I'd like to use is Control Alt Delete. So I think whenever we're in trouble, we press Control Alt Delete and suddenly magic occurs. So I think that could be what we look forward moving forward in terms of, as teams and leaders, what is it that we can control, or what are the perspectives that we have for our teams and individuals? What are the alternatives that we can give them? And then what is it that we have to delete from the old world to make sure that the new world's more sustainable? So in terms of control, I think, there are four things I think that really bring balance and harmony and a happier place to work. And that's how do we get our teams and individuals mentally attuned? And I think, hats off to so many companies out there that have identified mental health and doing some productive things to really help mental health and to identify where there's mental health, challenges. Because I think that's one of the greatest innovations that we've seen, that we're actually encouraging people to be vulnerable, encouraging people to talk. There's a great leader in this space, Fleur Hazelwood, who has a book called Resilience Recipes, and she references a lot of the little things that you can do to help that mental aspect. She openly says she borrows, there's a great YouTube video from Sean Aker. I think it's called the Secret to Being Happy at Work. And it can be little things, encouraging individuals to pick of three things, whether they meditate, whether they journal, whether they focus on sleep, and institutionalize that for 21 days to make it a habit. And I think, also one of the examples she used was a big retailer that had lots of challenges. There were bushfires, and then there was COVID. And so they set up a whole system of a mental health certificate that all their employees could spend a one-day workshop and really understanding what really drives the health of our people moving forward. So I think mentally there are things we can do. I think from a psychological safety point of view as well, I think, there are a lot of things that used to go on that we can't tolerate moving forward. If we want to be creative, we need companies who embrace building ideas rather than sort of shutting them down. And so mentally, there are things we can do. Physically, I think, there's been a lot of individuals through COVID have probably got out there and been more active, but there's probably things that, the workplace can do from a physical aspect to make it more encouraging for people to come into the workplace. Because, that's always the challenge that we hear. Elon Musk sort of saying that, unless you do 40 hours a week, you're no longer part of Tesla. But I think there is a balance, and I don't necessarily think it's time. I think it's purpose-led or output-led. So what are the things we can design physically to encourage people to be more engaged with work? And Google have been doing this for decades. I remember, they were one of the first companies that made sure that you could have lunch. Everybody could sit down for lunch, and they'd provide lunch for everybody. And people thought, wow, that's a pretty expensive thing to do. But Google Maps was one of the innovations that got born out of just a little conversation. They're investing in Manhattan at the moment when no one else is investing in Manhattan, and they're creating the most amazing environment for creativity. So it's not office block led but it's environment led and experience led, and it's encouraging people to come into work. So I think physically there are things we can do to help out. Swiss is another example, an Australian company who invest a lot of money in terms of encouraging people to enjoy them. They've had personal trainers that people can go to. They've got chefs that can cook food. They've got, and I think whilst that sounds a little bit frivolous, in these times, getting people together and bonding, I think, is a really important thing. From an emotional point of view, what are the connections and bonds that we can encourage? Marcus Buckingham's got this beautiful book that's just been launched called Love and Work, and it's really identifying what are the items that people really love doing in their personal life, and how can we as team leaders and teams fuse that into how they go about their work design. I think Lululemon is probably a great example of a company that emotionally looks at connecting their people. I think not only do you have to put in your CV, your work experience, but they also want to know what your personal passions are. And so if that's about being on The Voice, then how can you incorporate that creativity of singing into the workplace? So one guy I know who does this really well is a guy called Cole Ellis. He's got a book called Culture Fix, and one of the things that he insists on doing before any projects is looking at the communication styles. So, and getting people to work with the different communication styles so they can understand what really motivates them, so engages them more to be at work. And I think probably the last bit is the spiritual connection that you can have. So, what is the organization purpose? What is the team purpose? What's an individual purpose? And how do we connect the three to ensure that people are more engaged at work?
Yeah, wow. There's a lot to unpack there, and there's a lot of good kind of references. So the first thing I'll say is for everyone that's online, don't worry if you weren't writing down notes for all of those YouTube references or book references or authors. This will be put up on YouTube afterwards, so you can refer back to it. But I think two practices you touched on there that at Teamgage we take really seriously, because we know it's what develops the cohesion that lets the team get work done, especially now that there'll be hybrid. There'll be some people at home, there'll be some people in the Adelaide office, there'll be some people up in Sydney working out of an office up there or visiting customers. And so the two things we do is we take sharing food really seriously, and we make sure we kind of have some discipline around how we do that. And so that'll either be, a simple barbecue, the Bunnings style, or the Democracy sausage style barbecue. We've got some facilities here at the Lot 14 precinct, but doing that on a regular basis, not necessarily the best weather right now. But then the other thing is the opportunity for a team lunch. We try to do it basically every Friday, and it's a standing invitation, and everyone knows it's there. And certainly it's not, you don't have to be there, but we really want people to be there. And so we structure kind of the Friday around that. And it's like the conversations that are born out of either the walk down to a restaurant or actually when you're breaking bread over the table. Like, it's so interesting how like a problem gets solved, an idea gets surfaced, or it's nothing to do with work whatsoever. It's just a personal chat about similar family situations, similar hobbies. But the bond that gets formed then is so strong something very primal about doing that over a shared meal. And then when you go back to the office or you're talking over a call like this, it just enables things to work so much easier. So that's one we do. And then probably the second one is, this is maybe more of a personal thing, but I mentioned to you, our office here, we're lucky enough to be next to the Adelaide Botanic Gardens. And so on a semi-regular basis, if I'm in the office, I just try to, put something on Microsoft Teams and say, hey, who wants to take 10 minutes and just go for a stroll? And it's the same sort of principle. Sometimes we talk about work, sometimes we try and solve a problem, sometimes it's just about personal lives, but just disrupting our day, being in the fresh air, bringing a different environment. That's such a fundamental part to building the bonds that help a team work better together. So really practical examples that we do. Beautiful.
And they're all the elements that I think get missed. I think people focus on the productivity by not going to the office and staying at home and maybe going to the gym, but it's those connection points, those bonds that act in the collaboration. They're the things that I think get missed in this conversation, because they're the things that drive great creativity and innovation.
Yeah, there's I think it spun out of one of the teams of Atlassian. It may have actually been one of the founders talking about it, but he was sort of saying how they're rethinking their office spaces. The fact that teams are now, predominantly hybrid or a large part. And so it's like when people do come together in a physical environment, in an office space, it's actually less, in their sort of example, less about doing work, but it's about building the relationships and the rapport that let them do the work when they're separated. And I thought that was a really interesting mindset, and kind of touches to what you're saying there, is that, yeah, when people are together, performance and work outcomes are one thing to focus on, obviously, but there's all these other pieces, and it turns out those other pieces can be just as important, or arguably more important, to actually getting the performance and the work outcomes. So I suppose one other part to then touch on is, we've talked about this idea of perhaps having this numb or complacent culture, and what you actually want to do is transition that into high energy, and you want to focus on all those different components you mentioned, whether it's the psychological safety or the mental well-being or mental sort of fitness or physical fitness. Something you've also talked about is this idea of like teams disrupting themselves. And I suppose that's something I'd love to explore a little bit more. If you could share with the group, like, what does that kind of mean, and what does that look like, and why is it important?
And I think this is a really important element, because if you want to be the most innovative company in the world or more creative, you've also got to learn how to disrupt yourself. And I think, there are probably three phases where your team's at. There are some people who need to reset. There are some people that need to recharge, and there are probably some people who need to reinvent. And I think you need to identify the people in your team where they're at. So if they need to reset, you need to help them play to their distinctive strengths so they get some momentum. If they need a sort of recharge, you may encourage them to step back or take a sideward step to make a bigger leap moving forward. If they want to reinvent, to help them, to help them be discovery driven, and maybe look at running a business unit overseas. So I think instead of just being stuck in the same role for so long, how do we help them disrupt the way they work so those creative juices can flow endlessly moving forward? And I think it's a really important concept for teams to look at. How do they disrupt themselves, where they are on that disruption learning curve, and moving their people through so they can feel that they can progress and take their learnings to another level.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. So when it comes to that disruption though, we have a lot of HR leaders that we work with, and I'm sure there'll be a lot on the phone call today. What's something sort of, I suppose, that you've seen in your experience working with all of these customers, and maybe if you've got an example specific to HR, is like how they can help teams and leaders of teams disrupt the team itself?
I think, one of the greatest examples I've used, I worked at BlackRock and did a global project to help them build their creative confidence. And it was just fascinating to see the different countries where they inherently saw themselves as being creative. And so it's identifying what personality traits are best for a creative movement, and then helping them with the tools and behaviors to make them become more creative. And BlackRock went from a company that didn't see themselves as creative to being one that's a leader in their field.
Yeah, interesting. And what did the teams like go through to sort of, I suppose, both assess their creativity and then make changes? Like, what are they actually doing there?
Well, we provide them with a creativity audit that sort of put them into sort of 12 creative archetypes, so to speak. And then you could sort of see which ones they had strength in, which ones they may need development in, and then work a creative program against that.
Interesting. And who's the, well, actually, no, we were sort of talking on this yesterday. You said there was some pretty interesting, like, cultural differences in terms of how someone perceives their creativity. Yeah,
so when we, I always ask at the start of a creative session, who here thinks that they're really creative, and the people in Japan were sort of quite demure, and they'll probably put themselves at 2 out of 10. Where when we did a session with people in the US, for instance, they're probably 9 or 10. I always think that even though people may not think they're creative, there's somewhere in their lifestyle that they are creative, whether they're a great cook or a great surfer or a great dancer or singer. Creativity is for us all.
Yeah, definitely. Was there any Australians in that? Like, where did we, on average?
I think Aussies tend to back themselves quite a lot, so they normally are quite confident.
Yeah, and there's like maybe a veneer of humility, but we'll at least have a crack.
Definitely.
Okay, yeah, that's great. So one of the other, I suppose this like kind of feeds on from what we were just talking about then, is like one of the terms that is very much on your website and you speak to is this idea of creative enthusiasm. Like, what does that look like, and how do you help foster that?
I think one of the keys for creative enthusiasm is being in that sort of flow. So, people say that they're in the zone or in the pocket, but you sort of know when you're part of that type of organization, when people are being more playful, they're being brave with their ideas, they're actually getting momentum with those ideas, and they actually have some fresh thinking to drive, future creativity. And I think it's one of those elements of culture. When you're in it, you can feel it. And those who are in those organizations reluctantly ever want to leave.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm conscious of the time. We're sort of heading towards our 20-minute mark, and that's part of the purpose of Team Engagement Life. Is it's a relatively short conversation, but it's also supposed to be quite practical. You can walk away and take some ideas. So we've touched on the idea of sharing meals, thinking differently about how people come to the office, making sure that people are physically fit. We talked about the fact that obviously mental well-being and mentally fit has actually been handled relatively well over the last couple of years. It's a topic that's being talked about so much more, and for the right reason. But is there anything else that you wanted to share with the group today? Some practical tips that they can walk away with and maybe put in practice in their teams around either sort of moving away from that numbness or that complacency, or if perhaps that's not where they're at, actually just disrupting the way they're working now?
Look, I think one of the easiest things to do with your team is what I would refer to as topping up the freshness cupboard. Is getting them to think outside of their current norm of work. Now, when I was at CUB, like what you were saying, we were surrounded by some beautiful outdoor spaces, and I think just having meetings, and I think that's one of the byproducts of COVID. We've had to think differently about how we meet, and I think by doing that, we're not going to be sitting in grey Formica sort of offices having grey Formica ideas. I think moving forward, we're going to be in different environments, which will lead to greater stimulus and greater ideas. So topping up that freshness cupboard, I think, is probably the big key to driving a creative, enthusiastic culture.
Yeah, that's great. And it can be as simple as, perhaps not having the meeting in the room like I'm in today, but pick up those that are involved and go for a stroll out the front, dial some people in. It is really easy to do that now. So that's a good point. So we are coming to the end of our conversation. So obviously I just want to say thank you to yourself, Mark. This has been fantastic. Like I mentioned before, we're going to throw it up on YouTube at the end of this, so we'll be able to we'll go back and reference the books and the authors. For everyone that's listening in, we also will send out a short survey at the end of this. Please spend a couple of minutes and just give us the feedback. That's fundamental to kind of the culture of Teamgage, is asking for feedback, but then doing something about it. And so the feedback that you provide actually does guide how these conversations play out. I didn't mention this at the beginning, but sorry that Noel, the co-founder of Teamgage, wasn't able to join this conversation, I stepped in on her behalf. She's not feeling too well. The cold weather is having its impact on both her and her family, so that's where she is. But like I said, please do provide your feedback. And we have hundreds of people already subscribed to our mailing list specific for these events. So if you're not subscribed, please do subscribe, and you'll get notifications as we organize future events. So thank you so much for everyone that's joined in. Mark, thanks very much, mate.
Thanks, Ben. Been a great chat.
Yeah, it's been fantastic. Have a great afternoon, everyone, and stay clear of the cold weather. That's what I'm going to be doing, staying inside.